everyone, it's Sevi. Sumeru has finally dropped, and with it comes the long-awaited Dendro element. I've been having a blast testing different teams revolving around the Dendro reactions and characters. All these brand new possibilities are exciting and honestly a lot to take in. And so to help you get started with all these options, this video is a general overview and showcase of Dendro reaction team templates that we can have fun with going into version 3.0. I hope to explore these concepts more in future content too. Also, keep in mind that just because I didn't mention a unit doesn't mean they're not viable for the team. There's honestly a lot of variations available now, and so I'm mainly focused on giving you templates to work with. However, I will refer to specific units from time to time if they have a notable synergy with the reaction or team being discussed. Now, let's discuss these new things that have sprouted from Dendro's arrival. To start, here are a few general mechanics on how these reactions work. They actually work mainly like transformative reactions. For Burning, Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon, their damage is calculated using the trigger character's level, EM stat, and enemy's elemental resistance. For Aggravate and Spread, they are flat damage bonuses added on the triggering attack. Aside from the previously mentioned factors, they will also be affected by damage and crit multipliers, but more on that later. Let's start with Burning, a reaction we're very familiar with. Burning has been around since the start already, and we know that by combining Pyro and Dendro, it does Pyro damage over time. Even after the burning ends, the Pyro aura stays on since Pyro was reapplied. This means you can re-trigger Burning by applying Dendro again, and as long as you keep reapplying Dendro, you can keep on maintaining the Pyro aura and restarting Burning. So, if you want a pure burning team, what would the team template look like? In a way, this is like a mono pyro team with constant pyro application. Since it's Dendro that is almost always re-triggering burning, the Dendro unit's EM and level will matter the most for the burning damage. Dendro MC's burst has this mechanic where it will explode if it comes into contact with pyro before any other element, and since you're in a pyro heavy team, that will be the case. You also don't want hydro or cryo as that will ruin the burning reaction. So if you've wanted to improve your reputation as a Teyvat arsonist, this is the team for you. Now let's check out the Bloom reaction and teams. When Dendro and Hydro react, it triggers Bloom, which produces a Dendro core. After 6 seconds, the core will explode, dealing AoE Dendro damage. Simultaneously, the cores also follow a FIFO, first in, first out rule, where when the number of cores on the field exceeds 5, the oldest core will also explode to accommodate the new core. There's a significant difference on whether you trigger Bloom by applying Dendro on Hydro or Hydro on Dendro, and it has something to do with elemental gauges. To simplify it, if you have the same gauges of Hydro and Dendro, applying Hydro onto Dendro will only consume about half of the Dendro aura. Again, this is assuming both applications are the same gauge. Afterwards, there will still be a remaining Dendro aura that you can apply Hydro on again to trigger another instance of Bloom. It's the same principle of reverse vaporize or reverse melt, where they have a 0.5 times multiplier on gauge consumption, which often leads to the Hydro and Pyro aura respectively not being consumed immediately, so you can trigger another reaction onto it. On the other hand, applying Dendro onto the Hydro will consume the Hydro aura, since Dendro applied on Hydro will have a 2 times gauge consumption multiplier. This means that if Hydro is applied on Dendro, you can get more Bloom reactions and consequently generate more cores. Ideally, you want your units with high EM to trigger Bloom so that the explosion deals the most damage, but this requires you to be very deliberate with elemental application, which is more difficult to manage. Alternatively, you could just not care who triggers the Bloom and just unga bunga it to produce and explode cores as fast as possible. The Bloom AoE damage also deals damage to you if you're within its AoE. Thankfully, the damage you sustain is much lower than the damage it will deal to the enemy. As long as you have a consistent healer or shielder, it shouldn't worry you. These Dendro cores can react with Pyro or Electro, which is why Bloom combos open up more team options. I'll get to those very soon, but before that, let's talk about Bloom team templates. Technically speaking, a Bloom team can simply consist of a Hydro plus Dendro, then the 3rd and 4th slots can be a combination of Hydro, Dendro, or Anemo. One problem you might run into is that the enemies might run far away from the cores, thereby avoiding the Dendro damage. This can be remedied by having an Anemo crowd controller in the team. They help the enemies and Dendro cores stay together, since the cores can be pulled in and gathered. But another solution is to insert a Cryo unit, which leads to a more interesting variation variation to Bloom teams that has been dubbed Fridge. The team is basically a freeze team with Dendro cores exploding around the enemies. But how could this work when Cryo and Dendro cannot react with one another? Well, that's exactly why it works, and it has to do with gauge mechanics as well. First, Dendro and Cryo don't react to each other, so both a Dendro and Cryo aura can coexist on an enemy. Second, Freeze has a higher reaction priority than Bloom. This means that by applying Hydro on a Cryo Dendro affected enemy, it will first trigger a Freeze. Then the Freeze acts like a Cryo aura that doesn't directly react with Hydro. So any new Hydro applied will react with the coexisting Dendro instead of the Freeze aura, which will give you Blooms. Freezing your enemies in place is not only useful for survivability and crowd control, but also for ensuring they don't move out of your core's range. Now for some examples. A Fridge team will have one Hydro, Dendro, and Cryo unit. Your best choices for Hydro units are Kokomi, Xingqiu, Yelan, Child, and Ayato. So far, the best candidate for the Dendro unit here is Dendro Traveler thanks to their burst. And if it comes into contact with Hydro, it gets an AoE increase, which is helpful. Cryo units like Ganyu, Rosaria, or Kaya are great in delivering additional raw damage while maintaining freeze even from off-field. For your fourth slot, an Animo VV Shredder and Crowd Controller is a good option. Or another Dendro, Hydro, or Cryo unit that can either help battery the team, add more elemental application, or deal more damage. Now that we've covered Bloom and its team templates, let's discuss Bloom's sub-reactions, Burgeon and Hyperbloom, which have a higher damage scaling than just the core's explosion. If the core is affected by Pyro, it triggers Burgeon, which becomes AoE Dendro damage. But like Bloom's explosion, the Burgeon explosion can also damage you a bit, so shielding and/or healing are advised. A key thing to remember with Burgeon is that unless you keep up a lot of Hydro application, you don't want to apply so much Pyro on the enemy that you trigger Burning. Once you start triggering Burning on an enemy, you'll have a hard time triggering Blooms again, since you first have to get rid of the Pyro aura. For a Burgeon team, you'll need a Dendro, Hydro, and Pyro unit in the team. The fourth is a flex slot as long as it doesn't ruin the Burgeon setup. The goal is consistent Dendro, Hydro, and more controlled Pyro. Our best candidates at the moment for this are Toma and Xinyan, and their shields will give you protection from the Burgeon reactions explosions. But again, feel free to try Burgeon with a huge variety of Pyro units we have. Alternatively, if the core gets affected by Electro, it triggers Hyperbloom, turning into a single target Dendro damage called a Sprawling Shot. For a Hyperbloom focus team, you'll need a Dendro, Hydro, and Electro unit in the team. The fourth is a flex slot that won't ruin Hyperbloom. Some Electro options are more reliable Hyperbloom triggers. In general, if an attack is strictly targeting an enemy, it won't trigger Hyperbloom since it doesn't hit the Dendro core. However, if the attack deals splash damage, then as long as the splash hits the core, it will Hyperbloom. Larger AoE attacks are the most reliable ways to trigger Hyperblooms, like Cookie. Though there are plenty of Electro abilities that can easily perform Hyperbloom, consider that some Electro units will benefit more from Quicken-related reactions, which we'll discuss next. The other main branch of Dendro reaction starts with Quicken. When Dendro and Electro are applied to an enemy, the enemy enters a quickened state. You'll see it visually through green lightning crackling around the enemy. Inducing the quickened state itself doesn't actually deal damage, but it will allow you to trigger either Aggravate if you apply Electro on a quickened enemy, or Spread if you apply Dendro. Note that during the quickened state, the enemy has a Dendro-like aura on them which lasts a decently long time. This does not get consumed if you apply Electro or Dendro, so you can trigger multiple instances of Aggravate or Spread as fast as you can apply the element. And if you reapply both Electro and Dendro, you refresh the duration of the Quicken, so it's very possible to have 100% Quicken uptime. However, applying Hydro will get rid of Quicken and create a Bloom, while applying Pyro turns it into Burning. So if you're going for a strictly pure Aggravate/Spread focus team, avoid those elements. The damage calculation is done by adding a flat damage bonus on the attack that procced the Aggravate or Spread reaction. The flat damage bonus scales on the EM stat of the character. This is very similar to how Shenhe's Icy Quill or Yunjin's buff work. It also means that damage bonus multipliers and crit damage will will affect this damage. Now let's talk about the team templates. Aggravate or spread-focused teams will mainly have a Dendro and Electro unit with 2 slots which can be filled by Dendro, Electro, or Anemo characters. A very sought-after unit will be Fischl thanks to her A4 passive talent giving fast Electro application, and C6 if you have it. Yae and Beidou are also top choices in such a team. Yae's EM scaling in particular gets even more value now. Spread teams follow the same concept by having the Dendro DPS stack damage multipliers into their build to take advantage of that extra base damage. Tignari in particular has a good kit for this type of team if you get him, but at its core, this reaction allows you to lean into either your Electro or Dendro DPS's damage more. Now that we've looked at the various Dendro reactions, we can mix it up a bit. Certain teams can combine several of these Dendro reactions, just like how soup teams of a Hydro, Pyro, Electro, and Anemo exist to just proc all the reactions in that team as much as possible. We can do so with Dendro. For a vegetable soup team, you can have a Hydro, Electro, Dendro, and Pyro unit. Again, the most viable Pyro units here are those with controlled yet consistent application like Toma or Xinyan. In this team, you'll be consistently generating dozens of big and small numbers. It ends up being fun, unga bunga chaos as you're given flexibility with rotations as long as you can ensure keeping up your different elements as much as possible. Another option is to remove the Pyro unit and bring in an Anemo unit. The main reactions you'll see here are Bloom, Hyperbloom, Quicken, and its sub-reactions, giving it the nickname Quickbloom teams. Although it looks very much like a Hyperbloom team we discussed earlier, using an Aggravate-leaning Electro unit like Fischl will bring in more Aggravates rather than simply Hyperblooming, and it will buff her damage that way. Again, there's lots of room here to mix, match, and experiment. Feel free to try substituting your different units and creating your own teams using these Dendro reactions. I'm excited to see what future mechanics and teams the community can come up with too. That's going to be it for this video. Hopefully it gave you some ideas on how to introduce the Dendro element to your team comps and how to understand and work with them. So far, even with just 3 new Dendro characters to start with, I'm really liking the fresh synergies that we can already explore. However, there is still so much more to discuss, and I am really excited to further break down different Dendro teams, reactions, and concepts in the future. Let me know in the comments which team template interested you the most. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!